Tonight, blood will be spilled.
"You're coming with me," said the lone rancher after her in-laws tried to ruin her life. Caleb Stone measured his days by the hollow echo of the past. 20 years since the river ran red at Sand Creek. 20 years of dust and silence on a patch of unforgiving land in the Arizona Territory that faced resolutely away from any town or any hope. The harsh morning sun cast long, judging shadows across his small, desolate ranch, catching on the dented tin cup he held in his scarred, weathered hand. The sound came thin on the thermal wind, human, female, desperate, a sound that sliced through the ordered silence he had spent 2 decades building around his soul. Caleb set his cup down slowly, deliberate in this, as in all things, acknowledging the abrupt, sickening end of his peace. Following the sound led him not to a creek bend, but to a shallow draw carved into the red rock, where the heat collected and magnified suffering. She lay curled against the rough stone, stripped of clothing and dignity alike. Her skin, the color of the earth she belonged to, was bruised and bleeding. Her eyes, when they found his, held no tears, only the ancient, hollow resignation of one who had seen the worst of the invaders and expected no less from the white world. The turquoise pendant at her throat, the only thing they had not managed to take, felt like a small burning coal against her skin. Caleb removed his heavy, faded blue cavalry duster coat, the coat he wore not as a badge of honor, but as a shroud for his past, and turned his back to the indifferent Sunday. "Cabin's 2 ridges over, near the juniper. You move when you're ready, ma'am. Some choices defined a man's future." This one, a quiet, instinctive rejection of cruelty, would define both of theirs. In the brutal, unforgiving crucible of the Arizona Territory in 1888, dignity was the last possession, sometimes offered only by a stranger when all other humanity had failed. What would you do if faced with Caleb's choice? Risk the isolated peace you fought 20 years for to protect a stranger who threatened to drag your past back into the light, or ride away from a darkness that was never truly yours? Share your thoughts below on what true strength looks like in moments that test our humanity. If you believe some stands are worth taking regardless of the cost of everything follow for the next chapter in this story of quiet courage, desperate love, and unexpected healing. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. No one ever told me why, but some nights the silence out here is so loud it rings in your ears, a deafening drumbeat of every mistake you've ever made, every ghost you ever outran. My hands, calloused and scarred from the labor of trying to bury a violent past in hardscrabble earth, shake sometimes not from the cold, but from the fear that the quiet is only waiting for the next scream to start. If even this smallest act of decency, draping a coat over a woman whose suffering was etched into the very rock of the canyon, was a fatal error, then let the mistake be mine alone. A man can only stand so much quiet before he begins to pray for the noise. Caleb Stone woke before the sun, same as he had every day since he rode away from the massacre site 2 decades prior. 20 years of routine had worn deep paths through his solitary life. Coffee before dawn, checking the small herd of cattle at first light, endlessly repairing the fence line until midday. His isolated claim in the Tonto Basin demanded no conversation, asked no questions about the blue coat he burned, and then restitched, required nothing but labor and the vigilance of a man waiting for his sins to find him. He built the morning fire with practiced, economical movements, each piece of kindling placed with the precision of a man who wasted nothing, not wood, not lead, not words, and certainly not emotion. The small cabin was exactly as he had left it the day he finished building it, a shrine to absence. Dust had claimed every surface, save the small chest where he kept a few relics of the life he tried to leave behind, things too heavy to burn. The coffee bubbled in the blackened pot. Caleb poured the steaming liquid into his dented tin cup, carried it to the porch, and settled into the chair that faced away from the path leading to the distant, corrupt town of Red Rock Landing. The April sun, a brutal, indifferent entity in this territory, crept above the eastern ridge, painting long, deceptive shadows across his land. The heat was already promising a long, difficult day, Good weather for mending the barbed wire along the creek that bordered the unforgiving land of the Kincaid holdings. His fingers brushed unconsciously against the scar on his forearm, a wide, pale band of tissue he got not from war, but from a desperate attempt to stop a fleeing woman he'd accidentally shot during a scouting mistake. It ached when the air grew tense. Not today. Today should have been clear and empty like all the days he'd built since he traded his rifle for a shovel and his conscience for silence. Caleb finished his coffee, rinsed the cup at the pump, and saddled his horse, Goliath, with the silent, efficient movements that defined his existence. His claim stretched before him a few hundred acres of Arizona hardscrabble that asked nothing of him but sweat and persistence, both of which he had in abundance, having nothing left to spend them on but the earth. Then the sound came, faint at first. Not the cry of a hawk, not the dry rattle of a snake, but human. A cry carried on the fierce wind that whipped through the canyons, coming from the direction of the creek bed that marked his border with the Kincaid ranch. Caleb stilled, listening, every nerve honed by 20 years of danger snapping instantly alert. The sound came again, weaker now, a voice at the edge of surrender. He approached the creek bend with his old Winchester lever-action rifle held loosely but ready, wary of what awaited. The seasonal water ran thin and clear over smooth white stones. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of his boundary harsh junipers and defiant sagebrush clinging to the red clay. Then, movement caught his eye. Against the trunk of an ancient, gnarled cottonwood, partially hidden by the deepest shadow the canyon afforded, lay a woman. As Caleb drew closer, his jaw tightened at the sight. She was Navajo, though he didn't need the exquisite turquoise pendant at her throat, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of her skin to know her lineage. She had been stripped of clothing, her dignity torn away like the garments missing from her body. Bruises marked her arms and shoulders where hands had gripped too tightly. Her feet were scratched and bleeding from walking barefoot across the rough, baked terrain. She did not look up at his slow approach, but he saw her body tense, preparing for further torment, for the shame she had already endured to be compounded by the gaze of another man. Caleb averted his eyes, the gesture instinctive and immediate, an act of respect he had learned too late. The war had shown him the depths of human depravity, but this deliberate, calculated humiliation of a woman from a people he had sworn to protect stirred a cold, deadly anger he hadn't felt since the day he resigned his commission. He removed his coat, the faded blue cavalry duster he still wore, the coat that held both the warmth of his body and the cold weight of his failure, and took a step backward, away from the scene, and away from the choice he was about to make. "I'm leaving this coat here, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am emerging rough and unused from a throat that formed few words these days. He had no business speaking to her in a language she might not understand, yet he felt compelled to offer the words of a white man's apology, however inadequate. "I'll turn my back. My cabin's 2 ridges over, near the tall juniper. You come when you're ready." That. He placed the heavy coat on a sun-warmed slab of red rock, within easy reach of her trembling fingers, and turned his back, giving her the choice to take it or not, to follow or not. The decision would be hers alone. After what had been done to her, choice the freedom to choose her own destiny, however terrible the options might be, the only true dignity he could offer. Caleb walked back to Goliath, mounted, and rode slowly toward his cabin, not looking behind him once. The morning's empty, peaceful routine had been filled with unwelcome, terrifying complication, the kind of trouble that could get an honest man killed, or, worse, resurrect a dead one. But some lines, some cruelties, could not be ignored, even by a man who had built his life around silence and self-imposed exile. She appeared at his door less than an hour later, the blue coat clutched around her like fragile, heavy armor. Caleb had used the time to prepare, clearing the small second room, a mere storage alcove, that had stood empty since he built the cabin. He'd placed some items he kept for memory, a bowl, a spare tin of coffee, a clean, stiff linen shirt, outside the door, then retreated to the porch to give this stranger space to reclaim whatever composure she could. Standing in his doorway now, she looked both fragile and fierce, like a desert creature surprised but not yet broken. Dirt streaked her face, but her eyes, the color of wet obsidian, held a steady watchfulness. She recognized his power to harm, yet judged him unlikely to use it, a judgment that felt heavier than any accusation. Caleb gestured toward the alcove without stepping closer. "That small room is yours. A shirt and a blanket. Nothing more, I'm afraid." He paused, uncomfortable with so many words at once. He chose his final words with the bluntness of a man of the code. "I don't ask questions that aren't offered answers." She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that carried the weight of a warrior's agreement, then stepped inside. Caleb closed the heavy front door, then retreated to the porch, giving her space, silence, and the promise of solitude. He heard the careful opening and closing of the storage door, then silence. The tension, however, remained, thick and metallic in the air. Caleb retrieved a second tin cup, a newer, less dented one he had never used, and poured fresh coffee. He set it on the small table inside beside a plate of cornbread and salt pork, then returned to the porch. The meal was simple hospitality, nothing more than a man should offer another human being, but it was all he knew to offer. He did not eat. Through the window, he watched her eventually emerge. The linen shirt was too large, hanging loose on her thinner frame, but she wore it with a dignity that transcended circumstance. She approached the table cautiously, eyed the food as if it might be poisoned, then sat to eat with slow, deliberate movements, the movements of a person who had learned to savor safety. As twilight gathered, Caleb heard the unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. Not a single rider, but 3 or 4. He checked his rifle, his mind instantly calculating the angles of the sun and the shadows of the canyon walls. Who would come this far from the town of Red Rock Landing, and what did they want with a woman they'd already tried to destroy? Caleb hadn't been to Red Rock Landing in 2 weeks. It was a miserable, dusty place, built on greed and fear, and it stank of both. Judged by the way conversations died when he entered the general store, his presence was still too soon for some folks' comfort. The bell above the general store door jangled an unwelcome announcement of his arrival the previous day, drawing the eyes of 4 large, cruel-looking men gathered near the pot-bellied stove. Their gazes lingered, then deliberately turned away, as if looking at a ghost. The store owner, a man named Silas, set aside the ledger he'd been updating and approached the counter, his face grim. "Mornin', Caleb. I'll make this fast for both our sakes. Business only, right?" Silas knew Caleb's code of isolation. Flour, coffee, and a length of good cotton for patching. Caleb placed a small bag of silver coins on the counter. Silas's eyebrow raised slightly at the last item, but he nodded and began collecting the supplies. The men by the stove had resumed their low, menacing conversation, voices pitched just loud enough for Caleb to hear over the scraping of Silas's boots on the floorboards. "That Navajo piece Kincaid brought back? Ran off wild as her heathen mother, they say." The speaker was Jasper Kincaid, one of Thaddeus Kincaid's sons, a man whose face was already fat with inherited malice. The old man claimed she stole the title deeds to his new mine claim, said they were hidden in her tribal charms. Reward for anyone who spots her and brings her back to Red Rock Landing. This from another man, known for his cheap loyalties. Caleb kept his face impassive as he counted out the coin for his purchase, the slow, methodical pace, a deliberate message of control. Silas leaned forward, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Folks are watching what you carry out of here today, Caleb, especially Kincaid's boys. They're thirsty for that land she holds." He nodded once, understanding. The small, corrupt town survived on talk and the silence of the fearful. Someone had seen the bruised woman walking toward his remote claim, perhaps his unmistakable blue duster coat draped over her shoulders. As Caleb loaded his supplies onto Goliath, Sheriff Elias Vance watched from the porch of his office, his face unreadable beneath his sweat-stained mustache. Vance was a man who preferred to enforce the law only when it paid well. Neither man acknowledged the other. Silas locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and beckoned Caleb to the storeroom. The space smelled of leather, coffee beans, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of raw sugar. Silas lit a match to a lantern despite the midday hour. The small, flickering flame casting deep shadows across his worried face. "The Kincaids were here yesterday," Silas said without preamble. "Thaddeus and his 3 jackals turned this store upside down looking for Tsanitsa, that's her name. Narrow Rock, the tribe calls her. Kincaid wants her back or dead. Either way, he gets the deed." Caleb arranged his features to reveal nothing, not asking for her story, but Silas was a man who needed to share the burden of his knowledge. "Thaddeus Kincaid, the old snake, claims his son died of a fever. The truth is, William Kincaid was a cruel fool, drank too much, beat the girl something fierce. After the boy died, they treated Tsanitsa like livestock. When she objected to signing away her ancestral claim, the land the old man wants to run his railroad through, they took her out to the canyon." Silas's hand gesture completed what words wouldn't. Caleb's jaw tightened. "How many Kincaids?" "Thaddeus, and his 3 sons, Jasper, Simon, and the young one, Ethan, connected to everyone who matters in this territory. The judge owes them money. Sheriff Vance's brother-in-law is Thaddeus's foreman." Silas pressed a wrapped package, a dress, clean undergarments, and a brush into Caleb's hands. "When they come, and they will come, don't face them alone, Caleb. This isn't just a simple property dispute. This is land and blood." Caleb reached into his pocket to pay, but Silas shook his head, his tired eyes meeting Caleb's. "No charge for these. Call it a down payment on my soul." Caleb left payment anyway, placing a sack of coins on the counter. He slipped out through the back door, where fewer eyes would track his departure. The weight of the wrapped clothing seemed heavier than it should, laden with the complications he'd spent 20 years avoiding. Yet, as he mounted Goliath, Caleb found his hand drifting to the empty place on his chest, where his scout's badge had once been pinned, the badge he discarded after the massacre. Some habits, some codes of honor, died harder than others. He was now officially involved, and the canyon had made its verdict. Caleb returned to find the cabin swept clean, the fire stoked, and a pot of something that smelled better than anything he'd managed in years, a rich, earthy scent of gathered desert herbs and dried meat, softened by onion and a whisper of smoke. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the last orange of afternoon slid across the planks, turning dust motes into slow snow. He stood a breath, longer than he meant to, just inside the threshold, feeling for the first time in a long time like he'd stepped into a place that had been cared for, not merely endured. The woman, Tsanitsaatse, he corrected himself, stood by the iron stove, stirring the stew with a wooden spoon that made a faint knocking sound against the pot. She tensed slightly at his entrance, shoulders gathering, chin dipping, the body's old language of flight or defense. But she didn't flee. She kept stirring. Her composure wasn't fearlessness. It was the weathered grace of someone who'd traveled beyond ordinary fear and was now living in its far country, where everything was measured and spare. He placed the bundle from Silas on the rough-hewn table. "From the town. Silas Wheeler. Thought you might need these." Thank you." Her voice came quiet, low, controlled, carrying the dry strength of the wind that scours a canyon rim without seeming to move. 2 syllables in her tongue, then the translation, not as apology, but as a bridge set carefully between them. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. He realized, with a small and unbecoming startle in his chest, that he'd been waiting for the sound of her voice. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and moved to the basin. The water was fresh. The basin itself had been scrubbed and dried and set back at a precise angle that suggested ritual more than habit. He noted all of it. The packed earth floor swept until it was one color rather than a map of old boot prints. His 3 books, tattered almanac, dog-eared Emerson, a military manual he couldn't seem to let go, stood together on the shelf like they meant to be seen. The shaving kit closed, the mirror wiped, the blanket on the bed tight and square as a folded flag. She had imposed order on his emptiness without touching the core of what was his. It was an unspoken act of respect. He felt it the way a man feels a hand under his elbow when he stumbles and does not fall. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the clay-lined pot, the steam breathing an herbal calm into the room. "Stew," she answered. "Not much to work with." A trace of apology barely colored the words, a reflex to justify existence. to prove value. More than I'd have done with it. He meant it as gratitude. His voice came out rough anyway, shaped by too many nights spent talking to no one. She ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and set them on the table with a heel of bread he hadn't remembered owning, which meant she'd made it from the last flour, coaxing life from the scraps he'd been too careless to count. They ate in a silence that changed grain by grain, from taut silence to witness, to ceasefire, to something like ordinary. He watched, not directly but with the side of his attention, the careful way she held herself, elbows tucked, movements economical, eyes weighing the room as if memorizing an escape, hands working the spoon and bowl with a competence that had come from hard labor rather than leisure. She'd been taught to salvage, she'd been taught to endure, and beneath that, he sensed a discipline, a mind that had lived by the counting of things, days, water, seed, and the risk of men. The stew was better than he deserved, salted well, herbs that tasted like sage and something bittersweet he couldn't name, meat given just enough time to surrender without losing itself. He finished first, because he always did, and waited with his spoon down, because he remembered his mother once told him men could do that when they meant respect. When Say was done, she gathered the bowls and cups without being asked, not as a servant would, but as an equal paying her way in the currency of work. She moved like a person who refused to be a burden. He felt the message land inside him and take its seat. He set his coffee cup down and walked to the window out of reflex more than thought. He'd learned a long time ago to trust the sky's tone and the behavior of distance. "Riders coming," he said, shoulders squaring under his shirt as if the cloth itself had memory. "Best you stay out of sight." On the far lip of horizon, a dust smear gathered itself and came on. He'd expected this since Red Rock Landing. The Kincaids were coming for what they considered theirs, the woman, and through her, the papers they'd decided were theirs, by right of hunger. He lifted the rifle from its peg and propped it by the door, close enough for truth, far enough for hope. He stepped onto the porch. The late sun threw long blue shadows and turned the plain into a map of slow-moving glass. 4 riders reined in short of the yard, close enough to project, far enough to preen at their discipline. The eldest, Thaddeus Kincaid, carried his bulk like a prize he'd won by feeding good on other men's years. His gray beard lay on his chest like a small pelt. He had the look of someone already counting how much the place would bring when stripped to boards and kettles. On either side of him, the son's Jasper, with the ruined gaze of a man who enjoys the sound of pain, Simon, whose eyes slid away from hard things, and Ethan, young enough to tremble and call it impatience. The horses tossed, thin-skinned in the heat, tails swatting the flies that came as soon as men did. Caleb stood easy, hands away from the rifle, boots planted as if the porch boards were old friends. The silence stretched between them, a tight-roped length hung over an unseen drop. "You the squatting hermit, Stone," Thaddeus called, voice pitched to carry the habit of being obeyed. "I am Caleb Stone." He let the name stand, added nothing else. There was a power in leaving a sentence unfinished for a man like Kincaid to choke on. "I am Thaddeus Kincaid. These are my boys, Jasper, Simon, and the young one, Ethan." He gestured lazily. "We're looking for my daughter-in-law, Tsanitsa. Trail leads to your meager claim." Caleb watched their hands. Jasper's right hovered in that flattering way near the butt of his revolver. Simon's fingers fussed with his reins. Ethan's chin tried on bravado and found it too big. "This is private property, Mr. Kincaid. My claim. No trespassing." Thaddeus's mouth tightened beneath his mustache. "Territorial law says family has rights to retrieve their own, especially one unstable enough to run, carrying off family property." Law says a man's land is his to decide who stays," Caleb answered, shifting weight to place his body squarely between the men and the door. He made his stance tell the rest. "You harboring a thief, Stone? A savage who stole legal deeds when she ran?" Thaddeus swung down from the saddle, boot hitting dirt with a sound that meant to be final. He stepped across the invisible line Caleb had set like a man stepping onto a neighbor's porch because he believed the world was his. "That's a criminal matter in Red Rock Landing." Caleb held his gaze. He'd been looked at by worse. He'd been judged by men with epaulets and white gloves and phrases like, "for the good of the territory." He'd learned the art of saying nothing until the other man heard his own echo and wondered if it sounded foolish. The door opened. It made a small wooden sound that someone who hadn't listened to wood would miss. All 4 riders, and Caleb, turned. She stood on the threshold wrapped in the plain cotton dress Silas had given her, waist tied, sleeves rolled neat. Her knuckles were white on the doorframe, but her face was a stone river, no ripple. The porch set her above them just enough to settle a scale. The dress, modest and proper, was a quiet banner. Dignity, reclaimed. Thaddeus's posture changed. He oiled it with false fatherliness that left a greasy sheen on his words. "Tsanitsa, girl. Time to come home. Family sorts its own. You're embarrassing William's memory out here." She said nothing. She let the quiet grow until it made a sound of its own. The Kincaid boys shifted, their horses stamped, and the sun slid a degree lower. Jasper leaned, lips pulling into a smile that had gone to rot long ago. "Come now, Tsi. Simon's made the other cabin just as you like it." His tone made "like it" into a kind of threat. Simon looked down into his horse's mane as if it might tell him what a man was supposed to do. "She stays if she chooses," Caleb said, not loud, not soft. "She is under my protection and on my land." Thaddeus's face purpled in that way some men's faces do, when what they consider the natural order refuses to heal. "This isn't your affair. The woman's adult, like her father, cannot be trusted to make sound decisions. She's an unstable savage." "Seems clear-minded to me," Caleb replied. Say stepped closer to him, just enough that her shoulder hovered near the fabric of his sleeve. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. He felt the choice she'd made enter the record of the afternoon. Alliance had been struck without the borrowing of a single vow. Thaddeus clenched his hand on the saddle horn. "This isn't over, Stone. Not by a long measure. I will have that land deed, and I will have her. I will return with the sheriff." They mounted with quick, angry motions that weren't as tidy as they wanted to look. Dust rose. Thaddeus called back, "We'll return with the sheriff. Law's on our side in this territory." Caleb watched them dwindle to 4 motes in the flat brilliance. When the dust settled, the silence returned heavier for having been filled with men. He turned to Tse. "Reckon we should prepare for that." She didn't move. She stood staring at a bare patch of ground to the east of the porch. The soil there hard and cracked, small stones glittering like broken crockery. He almost asked what she saw. He stopped. Better to let the question arrive on its own, if it meant to. Her fingers went to the dirt, working it, testing its weight and crumble. She crouched, palm to the earth, like a doctor listening to a chest. The afternoon light laid a fierce calm across her face. "Do you have seeds?" she asked, shaking the room's residue off both their minds. "Vegetable seeds." He had to turn from the window to answer, surprised by the sudden pivot toward life. "Some in the shed from last year. Dry beans. Squash." "Oh. Could I?" The request came paired with hesitation, which told him the garden mattered more than the asking. "Would it be all right if I planted a garden here? On this ground?" He looked at the plot she'd chosen and saw what any man saw: clay, rocks, a ground taught to say no. "Land's not good for much. Clay soil. Too many rocks. My mother grew vegetables in worse," she said. A small, unguarded smile passed over her face like a bird shadow in mid-afternoon. It was gone so quickly, he almost doubted it. "I know how to make things grow." They walked to the shed. He'd kept it in a soldier's order. Tools hung by size, oiled handles, the whetstone wrapped, nails sorted into jars with neat paper labels. He found the tin with seeds, beans, squash, tomatoes, sun-dried, and saved in a folded paper envelope. "Not much," he said, handing her the box. "Never had the touch for growing." "Oh." She studied the seeds, rolling a bean between finger and thumb, listening to the quiet rattle of a season. "These will do to start. We might need more later." He heard it, the plural, sinking anchor inside him. Need more later. A future, named without ceremony. He gave a brief nod, because anything fuller would have been too much for his throat. He found a spade and a hoe, the wood worn smooth by hands that weren't his wife's long ago. He hadn't touched them in years, though he had kept them close, as if keeping the tools ready kept the loss from triumph. She took them with a reverence that didn't belong to the tools at all, but to the story in them. She didn't ask whose they'd been. She didn't need to. By sundown, stones from the wash had become a boundary. Line by line, she made furrows in defiance of rock and habit. The ground gave reluctantly, the way a man gives when you've looked him in the eye long enough. Caleb watched from the stoop, the small beginnings settling themselves into the evening. It wasn't just gardening. He knew the difference. It was roots. It was a claim resung in a quieter key. He felt the cabin change shape around it, becoming not only shelter from wind and sun, but a place that might hold food, memory, and a season of waiting that wasn't simply a sentence. As darkness lowered, a single horse came on, slow and reliable as a clock. Caleb listened. The steady beat, the stop and blow of a gelding who knew his work. "Sheriff Vance," he said. Tse's hands stilled in the furrow. She did not run. Another victory, small but true. Sheriff Elias Vance removed his hat as he reached the yard, a gesture that tried to honor what his breast pocket might betray. At 51, the man wore the fatigue of someone who'd bargained daily with power and found himself poor at day's end. His mustache sloped like the corners of his mouth. He stood on the ground and did not quite dismount, as if ready to call this visit a conversation rather than an act. "Evening stone, ma'am." He nodded in both directions. His eyes lingered a heartbeat longer on Tse's dirt-stained hands and the organization of stones than perhaps he meant them to. "Sheriff," Caleb said. Vance cleared his throat, found it unhelpful, and did it again. "Had a visit from Thaddeus Kincaid today. He's filing papers claiming his daughter-in-law is unwell, seeking guardianship under territorial law. He also has papers drawn for your arrest on a kidnapping charge. She seems perfectly well to me." Caleb's voice held level, but his body shifted tiny adjustments a trained eye would track, stance broadening, breath going lower, attention sliding outward. The sheriff glanced at Tse. She met him with a gaze that didn't blink for the sake of a man's comfort. He looked away first, which was the whole content of that moment and the record it kept. Vance lowered his voice, though not enough to keep it from her. "Judge Crawford owes Kincaid money considerable. This won't go your way in court. Kincaid wants the land claim she holds rights to." "Do I have any say?" Tse asked. Her voice had the cadence of instruction, a teacher's confidence in the articulation of a rule, even when the rule wasn't kind. The sheriff shifted, thumbs worrying the hat brim. "Ma'am, legally, not much. Widows, of non-white citizens, often fall under the protection of the husband's family unless they remarry or have means." "And if I have employment?" she asked, honing to the loophole like a seamstress to a long-stored needle. "If I am not dependent? Might help," he conceded. "But Kincaid's reach is long. He owns the judge and most of Red Rock Landing." "When's the hearing?" Caleb asked. "Because time is a frontier, too." "Friday. Crawford's court." Vance put his foot back in the stirrup, the conversation's end written in the line of his back. "For what it's worth, Stone, I'm sorry. Some things ain't right, law or no." "Some things ain't," Caleb agreed. The sheriff rode away into a darkness that rose from the ground rather than falling from the sky. The cabin's lamp threw a warm oval on the dust, and the garden stones held the day's heat while giving it back to the air in a soft, invisible bloom. Caleb and Tse stood a while without speech. Finally he asked, "You know anyone might help? Family, friends, someone outside Kincaid's reach?" Her eyes hardened into the kind of truth that doesn't enjoy being told. "There's no one. Not anymore. Just us." The words laid themselves between them like planks making a bridge, plain, sturdy, not beautiful, and enough. He nodded once, the kind of nod a man makes to himself before he turns to the thing that must be done. "Then we'll get you employment. We'll get you papers to say it. Work for hire. Wages recorded." She answered with the smallest of movements, a tilt of her chin that meant, "I will meet you in this. I can teach. I can spin wool, I can sew, I can read and write both languages." He weighed each skill against the county's pettiness. "Schoolhouse at Mesquite Draw needs a teacher, but the board sits half Kincaid. We'll not start there. Widow Hargreaves needs mending. She pays in coin when she's not down to credit. I will go to her, said. But I do not want charity. It won't be charity, he replied. It'll be an agreement between adults, written proper. And you? She added, not challengingly, but as if she were taking the measure of a ledger. Will you hire me, if I need 2 employment papers? It took him half a second to see the wisdom. Yes, gardening and house order. Record of provisions managed. Payment in cash weekly until Friday. Then we bring the book to the judge. Then you must not overpay, she said, and there was the ghost of humor in it. Or they will say you purchased me. He nearly smiled. He didn't let it escape. I'll pay a fair wage for work I can't do myself. He hesitated, then added, and for stew I'm already addicted to. She turned toward the stove, as if to hide something like warmth. Tomorrow the garden, she said. Tonight you will write my employment, and I will sign. They went inside. He cleared a space on the table, laying out the few sheets of paper he had left. The quill was chewed at one end. From a winter he'd been too lonely to stop. He sharpened it on the penknife and dipped carefully. He wrote slow, careful letters, her name first, spelled as she had taught him, with the apostrophe placed where breath belonged. He wrote the date and the terms. Room and board separate from wage. Wage in coin. Work specified. Hours named in a way that didn't suggest ownership. Only agreement. He wrote a second contract for Widow Hargreaves, leaving the employer's name blank. When he slid the paper to her, his hand shook once, the tremor not fear but something like ceremony. She read every line with lips moving. Then she signed her name, rendered with a beauty he would have framed if framing didn't feel like a theft. He reached for the ink blotter. She pulled back, palm lifted. Wait, she said softly. She reached into the pouch at her waist and produced a small seal bone, worked smooth, carved with a symbol he didn't recognize, a spiral that broke into 4. She pressed it beside her name while the ink was wet. It left a precise ghost of intention. He looked up. She met his eyes. My father carved it, she said. It wasn't explanation so much as inheritance declared. Then it's proper, he answered. The lamp burned low. Outside, a coyote called, and another answered from farther west, their conversation as old as anything. He rinsed the quill and set it on cloth to dry. She gathered the bowls from earlier and washed them again as if to rinse the day a second time. He carried wood in, an unneeded task that let his hands do something his mind could not. You should sleep, he said, when the chores had all been invented and completed. I will, she answered. She hesitated at the bedroom's hanging blanket, then turned back. When they come on Friday, I will stand with you. I will not run. He believed her. Then we'll make Friday answer to us, not the other way around. She nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. She went into the small room and let the blanket fall. He heard nothing for a span of minutes. Then the softest sound, a woman kneeling by a bed. He didn't know if she prayed. He didn't need to. He lay on the pallet by the fire, as he'd done 1,000 nights in 1,000 kinds of silence. This one was different. It contained another person's breath and another person's plans. He felt the fact of that like a second pulse. He stared at the roof's crossbeams and counted 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted because numbers are a kind of promise when words aren't enough. Dawn came thin and impartial, like the first sip of creek water. He rose before it could fully arrive. Say was already outside, hair braided, dress pinned, hands on the spade. The earth was still cool from night, easier to ask things of. He went to the shed and returned with a bucket. They worked without talking at first. He lifted stones and carried them to the new wall. She cut shallow trenches and dusted the bottom with ash saved from the stove potash to sweeten the clay's sourness. She told him without turning that mixing sand from the wash would help the soil drain. He fetched it. She sprinkled crushed eggshells where the tomatoes would go, the brittle white like snow on a far ridge. He learned the names as she said them, the bean that climbs if you trust it, the squash that keeps, the tomato that needs a fence, the herb that brings bees who bring everything else. He liked the way her voice warmed when she named each thing's habit. He liked the way his name sounded when she used it to ask for the hoe. By the time the sun had taken its seat, the garden had a shape that could be seen from the road. It declared itself and asked no permission. He stood with his hands on his hips and let himself feel the ridiculous pride a man feels for having helped carry water for a miracle someone else made. She pressed a line of seeds into her palm and held them for an instant, as if reminding them of what they could be. He looked away, not to intrude on a conversation he couldn't hear. At noon he saddled the bay mare. "Hargreaves," he said, "I'll ask fair and keep it on paper." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I will come," she said. "I will not be traded between men without speaking for myself." "Then you'll speak," he agreed. They rode the 2 miles in a heat that rang like metal struck. The widow's place sat in a shallow bowl of land where cottonwoods found a bit of water others missed. Hargreaves met them on her porch with knitting in her lap and suspicion for an apron. Tse stepped forward before Caleb could herald their case. She spoke in clear English and named her skills and held the contract flat in both hands. The widow squinted at the paper, then at the woman who would do the work. Finally, she nodded. "I'll sign. You'll be paid Fridays. I don't buy women, and I don't rent them. I hire help." She looked at Caleb. "And I don't hire men to tell me the price. Lef." "Then we got no quarrel," he said, and meant it. The widow fetched a stub of pencil and added her name. Tse pressed her bone seal to the paper as if placing a small sun there. Caleb made a duplicate for their records. Hargreaves stood, hands on hips, and looked at Tse's dress and the way she stood in it. "You're set to be shamed on Friday," she observed without malice. "Men like Kincaid count on a woman's fear." Tse answered, "I have been ashamed before. I did not die of it." "Le." The widow's mouth softened. She lifted her chin sharply toward the lane. "Then you'll do." They rode back with the second paper under Caleb's shirt, a cool rectangle against his ribs. The sky had gone bright and merciless. Heat flung the far mountains back a mile. He counted distance, water, the angles of shade a body could find between now and nightfall. Beside him, Tse rode steady, seat light, hands gentle on the reins. He realized he didn't know where she had learned to ride that way. He realized he didn't need to. In the afternoon, they set up a fence for tomatoes, binding willow switches together with cord he twisted from spare jute. She showed him the knot her father had used, simple and sure. He bound the fence, as she directed, the two of them passing switches and cord, hands meeting and parting in a clean rhythm that felt like a song sung under breath. Toward evening he set paper and pen on the table again and wrote the second contract clean. He pressed the day's ink between blotter and palm. Tse read and did not change a word. He thought of his wife not as a ghost to compare, but as a life that had ended without scandal or storm, and felt, with a surprising absence of guilt, that the house had made room for this new arrangement because it had to, because the world keeps insisting on its own continuation. They ate bread and stew, the flavor deeper for having spent the day outside. He told her about the sheriff's likely tactics, about the courtroom that wasn't a room but a sawmill's office borrowed for the purpose, about the judge who liked to drum his fingers when a thing couldn't be said outright. She told him about the way water moves under soil, and how you can keep it near the roots with stones placed just so. They shared their trades like two old soldiers, swapping maps. Night brought a breeze. He oiled the rifle and laid it on the wall peg. She folded the two contracts into the oilcloth she'd brought and tucked it in the hollow under a loose board she found by tapping with her knuckles. He would not have found that hollow in a year. He nodded approval. She gave him the ghost of another smile. When the lamp was down to a single small tongue of light, she asked, "When you were a soldier, did you always know which hill to take?" "No," he said, "but I learned which hills meant you'd never get off them if you tried." "And this?" She meant the cabin, the garden, the coming Friday. "What is it?" "It's a hill we hold," he said, "not because it's high, because it's ours." She accepted that. She pulled the blanket door aside and disappeared into the small bedroom, leaving behind a faint trace of sage on the air. He lay again by the fire. Sleep came like a wary dog, circling twice before lowering. He closed his eyes on the knowledge that in 2 days' time, men would come to say what was and wasn't lawful. He opened them again on the steadier knowledge that the earth beyond the porch now held seeds that hadn't asked the judge's permission. The next dawn, the garden showed its first honest change. Not green, not yet, but the look of ground that had been asked to remember. He brewed coffee and burned it a little, as was his custom. She took a tin cup and drank it anyway, the tiniest of winces in the corner of her mouth. He laughed, and the sound surprised them both. They rehearsed. He played the sheriff, then the judge, then Thaddeus with his false tender voice. She answered with the steadiness of someone who had been stripped of things and learned how to stand anyway. They practiced saying employment and wage and contract in sentences that fit a courtroom shape. He taught her how to wait while men murmured, how to stand inside the noise like a stone in a river. She taught him how to place his words so they landed like pebbles at the right distance. By afternoon, thunderheads shouldered up on the far edge of the world, building themselves into a drama that looked like rain and seldom was. He kept one eye on that lie while they hoed and watered, and mended a cracked bucket with pitch warmed over the stove. They were at the table again, rationing the last of the flour into tomorrow's bread, when they heard hooves in an arrhythmic cluster that meant impatience. Tsi's hands stilled. Caleb stood, breath deepening. He walked to the door and looked out. Not the sheriff. A messenger, Kincaid's boy, not one of the three, but hired for speed. The boy threw a folded paper toward the porch as if afraid the step might bite him. It landed face down in the dust. Caleb picked it up and read. It was a summons, dressed as civility. Friday at 9, the sawmill office in Red Rock Landing. Sign here to acknowledge you've been informed. Caleb held it out. Tse read, then flipped it over and pressed her seal to the half-clean space in the corner, a private countersignature below the official scrawl. He smiled without showing teeth. You've marked the county, he said. I have marked the truth, she answered. They watched the messenger ride away, kicking at his horse's sides to convince himself he wasn't afraid of the place he left behind. Caleb could feel Friday on the air already, 3 numbers from now. He could count them. One more sunrise to strengthen the garden's lines. One more round of practice at the table. Then the day itself, which would require a particular kind of walking into a room head up, papers prepared. Rage cooled and folded small in the inner pocket. Evening again. Coyotes again. The first star came sooner than it had the night before. He wondered if time itself had decided to help them, hurrying past the wait to get them to the fight. He banked the fire. She checked the oilcloth packet a last time. He wished not aloud that he could fold her into a pocket that no man could reach. She seemed to sense it and shook her head gently, as if telling him that there are some wishes that weaken the wisher. On the last night before Friday, she told him, sudden as a hawk's drop, "My husband's father believes paper makes the world. He forgets that men make paper." Caleb answered, "We'll remind him." They slept. Dawn came gray and spare. The garden showed nothing yet, because seeds have their pride. He saddled the bay, brushed her with unusual care, and chose a clean shirt. Tsi plaited her hair into 2 tight braids and pinned them at the nape, then tied the plain dress with a strip torn from the bottom so it fit more exactly. She placed her bone seal in the pouch at her waist and slipped the oilcloth packet into the inside of her bodice, where no one but a fool would reach. They did not pray together. They didn't need to. They stepped onto the porch at the same moment, and it felt like the most honest liturgy either of them had kept in years. Caleb locked the cabin, which was an act more symbolic than useful, and slid the key into the space under the stone, where only people who understand stones hide keys. They mounted. The bay mare tossed her head once and settled. The trail to Red Rock Landing opened ahead, a thin scar through the grass. He looked once over his shoulder at the garden stones and the hard lines of furrow between. The sight lifted something in him that had sagged for seasons. They rode out, 2 figures proportioned small by the plain, but not diminished. The sun climbed. The town drew closer by numbers a man could count. 4 miles to the wash crossing, 2 to the split pine, 1 to the stack of cut logs by the sawmill where Fridays were made and unmade. He felt the weight of his rifle, the weight of the papers, the weight of the woman who rode beside him, and did not lean. At the edge of town, he slowed. "Whatever happens," he said, not looking at her, "we hold to the truth we can carry." She answered, "Just us." He let the words fill him, simple as water, invincible as need. He clicked to the mare and rode the last stretch at a purposeful walk. The sawmill office was already loud with men arranging the world to their liking. He could smell cut pine and ink. He could hear Thaddeus Kincaid before he saw him, playing at gravity with his voice. Caleb felt his heart take its position, low and steady, like a good horse in bad ground. Beside him, Tse reached into the small space between them and touched the back of his hand with the tips of 2 fingers, a touch so brief it might have been a wind misreading. It was enough. They dismounted in one motion and stepped up onto the planked porch as the 9 o'clock bell in someone's memory rang once. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Sheriff Vance returned at dawn 2 days later, the air still cold enough to bite at the skin, the eastern horizon only just beginning to glow with a thin smear of pale fire. He rode slow, shoulders hunched, the weight of his duty pulling at him heavier than the tin star pinned to his chest. In his hand, folded and sealed with wax, lay the documents that would decide the next turn in this struggle. The harsh morning light did nothing to soften the resignation in his eyes as he dismounted in front of the cabin, boots crunching the frost-stiff dirt. Caleb was already on the porch, rifle leaning against the wall beside him, hat pulled low. He knew the look of men who carried bad tidings, and Vance had been riding with that look for half a mile. In the doorway behind Caleb, Tsanitsa stood silent, her frame outlined by the dark of the cabin interior, face composed though faint shadows beneath her eyes betrayed the long nights of worry and the sleepless hours spent staring at ceilings and listening for hoofbeats. The skin of her cheeks bore the color of sun and dust, not of weakness, and her gaze was steady even as the sheriff approached. Vance cleared his throat, pulling the folded packet from inside his coat. "Court hearing set for tomorrow, Friday," he said, his voice betraying the discomfort of a man caught between the law written on paper and the justice he knew in his bones. 10 o'clock at the courthouse in Red Rock Landing. "The kidnapping charge is still on the papers, Stone." He handed the summons over, avoiding the woman's eyes as though he might burn under the quiet force of her presence. Caleb unfolded the documents, scanning the stiff legal language, brows drawn tight. "On what grounds?" His voice was calm but hard, a tone that carried more threat than shouting ever could. "Abandonment of the marital home, mental instability, Thaddeus's word for being Navajo, and defiant and theft of family property." The sheriff recited each charge with the flatness of someone forced to repeat lies he did not believe. Pretty standard for Kincaid's kind of power. Tsanitsa's voice cut the silence, low and fierce. "I took nothing but my great-grandmother's turquoise pendant, the one that guarantees my right to the Narrow Rock land." Her fingers rose unconsciously to the small silver-set stone at her throat, the one possession they couldn't strip from me by force. For once, the sheriff looked ashamed, his eyes flickering downward. "You'll need to appear, ma'am. If you don't, judgment defaults to the Kincaids. They've already lined up 3 witnesses ready to swear to Mrs. Kincaid's episodes." "Oh, fabrications," she said, her tone like a blade unsheathed. The word hung sharp in the morning air. "Maybe so, ma'am," Vance admitted, shifting his weight, hat brim twitching nervously between his fingers. "But sworn testimony carries weight when the judge's pockets are already lined with Kincaid's coin." When the sheriff rode off, dust trailing behind his horse like a shadow stretched too thin, Caleb slid his hat onto his head and turned toward Tse. "I know someone who might help, Tomas Reyes. He knows the law as it's written and the law as it's practiced, which is a different thing entirely out here." Her answer was immediate, not a question but a statement. "I'll come with you." In those words, he heard the shift no longer a woman seeking shelter but a partner stepping into battle. He gave a small nod. It was accepted. Tomas Reyes' forge stood at the edge of Red Rock Landing, close enough for business, far enough to remind everyone of his mixed blood. The clang of his hammer reached them before the sight of his shop, ringing through the early morning air like the heartbeat of iron itself. Sparks leapt into the dim, and the acrid tang of worked steel filled their nostrils. Tomas was a tall man, 44 years of lines carved into his skin by both heat and history, his black hair streaked with gray and tied back with a leather cord. His eyes, sharp and deliberate, missed nothing as they watched Caleb and Say approach. "Been a while, compadre," Tomas said without pausing, the hammer striking, then plunging the glowing iron into water. Steam hissed upward, wrapping the room in ghostly vapor. 3 years, 2 months since you traded your smithing hammer for a judge's gavel," Caleb replied, tying his horse. His words carried the weight of old camaraderie and older respect. He noticed, too, the careful dip of Tomas's chin toward Sinitsa, acknowledgement without condescension. "We need your help, Tomas. Kincaid business. Legal." Caleb handed over the summons. The blacksmith wiped his hands on the leather apron, jaw tightening. "The buzzards already circled," he muttered. "I heard. He wants the woman, and through her, the land." He gestured them to a small back room where shelves bowed under the weight of ledgers, law books, and old court filings, a scholar's corner, hidden behind the smoke and hammer of his public trade. He looked directly at Say, his tone respectful, his questions blunt. "You were forced to marry William Kincaid?" Her chin lifted, unyielding. "Yes, and now his father claims I am his property." And Tomas's eyes darkened as he examined the paper Caleb gave him. He read slow and exact, lips moving slightly, trained mind parsing each word. After a silence, he tapped the page with his finger. "There may be a way. Not as a widow, as a worker. You carry different rights. Not the rights of a wife, but of a free laborer under contract." He sat at a rough table, ink and quill already at hand. His script was educated, fluid. Employment contract, dated 2 days before this court filing. Title: Ranch Steward and Land Manager for Caleb Stone's claim. It sets payment, lodging, clear authority. With this, you are not a dependent, but an employee. The scratch of his pen was steady, the words falling into place like nails driven into wood. "It shifts the burden. Kincaid will have to prove fraud, rather than you proving sanity." Caleb studied the parchment, skeptical. "Will it hold against Crawford?" "Maybe," Tomas admitted. "It gives the judge an excuse, if he wants one, to deny Kincaid without losing face. Sometimes the law is less about truth than about which fiction a judge finds easier to wear." Say placed her seal upon it, a bone-carved spiral pressed into the wet ink, and in that moment something heavier than law was recorded. Caleb felt it. Tomas saw it. The road to Red Rock Landing stretched long and merciless under the Sunday. Caleb drove the wagon steady, hands light but eyes restless, scanning horizon and sky. Say sat beside him, the contract folded in her satchel, her face calm, but her lips silently rehearsing the words she would speak. He watched her once, quietly, the way a man watches a hawk riding currents far above, unreachable, unbreakable. "Crawford will try to talk over you," Caleb said after a while, his voice gravel. "Hold the contract high. Don't let him drown you." Her answer surprised him. "I was a teacher before the Kincaids." She glanced at him, the desert light glinting in her dark eyes. "On the reservation, I know how to make my voice heard above arrogant men." He blinked, almost smiled. "Didn't know you were a teacher." "There's a lot about me the Kincaids tried to bury," she said, "but I remember who I was before William decided to make me his property." They stopped once at Silas Wheeler's store. The old man pressed a shawl into Tsay's hands. "For the courthouse," he whispered. "Appearances matter. Keep your chin high." His eyes shone with something close to pride, or hope. Maybe both. By the time they reached town, the courthouse stood waiting in the center, its whitewashed boards yellowed by the Arizona Sunday. 4 horses tied out front bore the Kincaid brand. The sight was enough to stiffen Caleb's jaw. They paused at the steps. He offered his arm. "Ready?" She adjusted her dress, lifted her chin. "I've been ready since the canyon." Together they walked inside. The room was packed gossips, ranchers, drifters, faces hungry for spectacle. The Kincaids sat at the front, Thaddeus in the middle, his sons flanking like wolves. Judge Crawford presided, his dignity already wilted by sweat stains on his collar. The gavel cracked 3 times. Petition for guardianship of Mrs. Tsanitsa Kincaid, filed by Thaddeus Kincaid. He peered over his spectacles. Mrs. Kincaid, your father-in-law claims you cannot manage your affairs. How do you respond to charges of theft and instability? The room hushed. Tse's voice carried clear, steady as riverstone. I am capable, Your Honor, as evidenced by my employment contract with Mr. Caleb Stone and my ancestral right to my people's land, which the Kincaids are attempting to steal. She lifted the paper Tomas had drafted. Murmurs rippled. Thaddeus surged to his feet. Fraud, a mockery, ridiculous. The judge half-heartedly hushed him. Tse pressed on, voice sharpened by truth. After my husband's death, the Kincaids tried to take everything. They demanded I marry Simon. When I refused, they stripped me, left me to die in the canyon. I took nothing but my ancestral pendant. The crowd shifted. Women whispered. Men frowned uneasily. She lies, Thaddeus thundered. Unstable as her tribe. I am employed as ranch steward and land manager, said firmly. I am no one's property. My mind is clear. My work is honest. Judge Crawford squirmed, examined the contract, searching for fault. None he could seize without risking appeal. At last, grudgingly, this requires review. The court reconvenes in 1 month. Meanwhile, respondent may continue her employment with Mr. Stone. Kidnapping charges are dismissed temporarily. The gavel struck. Victory, but fragile. Outside, Thaddeus grabbed Caleb's arm, hissed in his ear, "You'll wish you'd died in your cavalry uniform. That ranch is about to burn hotter than hell." The smell of smoke woke Caleb. Not the clean pine smoke of the hearth, but acrid, choking the stench of coal oil and burning hay. He bolted upright, instincts honed by years of soldiering firing in an instant. Through the window, an orange glow licked the sky. "Fire!" he roared, boots already pulling on. Rifle slung over his shoulder by reflex. Outside, the corral blazed like a furnace. Flames devoured the new fencing, the trading shed beyond it roaring in infernal hunger. Horses shrieked inside the enclosure, cattle bellowed in panic, pressing against rails that began to splinter and burn. Tse appeared, face pale in the glow but set with grim resolve. The animals, the buckets, the pump. "Stay back," he barked, already running headlong. Heat blasted him, a wall of pain. He ripped his old duster over his head, plunged into smoke, seized his mare's halter, dragged the terrified beast toward the gate. She resisted, eyes rolling white, hooves striking sparks, but his sheer weight and will forced her through. Outside, he slapped her flank and she bolted free. He turned back. Smoke scalded his lungs, eyes streaming. Another horse thrashed within, caught in flame and shadow. He staggered in again, coughing, dragging, choking, pulled the animal through just as part of the roof crashed down, a shower of sparks chasing them into the night. Meanwhile, Tse had formed a bucket line from the well, neighbors roused by the light helping, but they all knew. The fire had been set deliberate. Coal oil's slick stench clung to the dirt. Every bucket was defiance, not salvation. By dawn, the corral lay in smoking ruin. Blackened beams, twisted metal, the air thick with ash and despair. 2 horses saved, 1 lost forever. The trading shed gone, tools, wagons, months of labor reduced to cinders. Caleb stood, face black with soot, shirt scorched, chest heaving with smoke-racked coughs. Tse came to his side, her own face streaked with ash and sweat. "This was them," she said hoarsely. "The Kincaids." Caleb nodded. Words seemed useless in the face of such certainty. "It could have been worse," he rasped at last, eyes on the rising Sunday. "Could have been the house while we slept." But they both knew the truth. This wasn't just fire. It was declaration. War had been set. And as the ashes smoldered, as the acrid wind carried the scent of ruin across the land, Caleb Stone and Tsanitsa stood side by side in the wreckage, smoke curling upward like a promise. They would not bow. They would not run. Not now. Not ever. "Hey, friend, pause a moment. Go fill a glass with cold water and drink it down. Stretch your shoulders. Blink your eyes away from the screen. Hydration and breath are the simplest forms of strength, and you'll need both for the road ahead. Sinitsa found Caleb's packed saddlebags before he could hide them. Her face went still as stone when she saw them on the bed, his Winchester leaning against the wall beside them. The implications were clear enough. He was preparing to leave, whether to confront the Kincaids in a blood feud or simply flee. She couldn't tell, but the outcome would be the same. "You're leaving." Her voice was flat, carefully emptied of emotion. Caleb turned, surprised to find her in the doorway. He hadn't heard her approach over the dull, angry ringing in his ears. "Going to end this my way," he admitted, with violence not a question but an assessment. With whatever works, his jaw was set in a hard line, a familiar grimness that reminded her of the determined, ruthless scout who'd once worn a uniform. The man she feared was still lurking beneath the solitary rancher. Sinitsa entered the room, her movements careful as she approached the window. Outside, the scorched earth where the corral had stood was still smoking in places, a monument to Kincaid vindictiveness. "I should be the one to go. This is my fight that's cost you everything. I will ride toward the reservation lands. They won't follow me there." "This was my choice," Caleb said, the words emerging roughly. He continued packing. Ammunition, a small bag of coffee, dried jerky wrapped in cloth. Sinitsa turned to face him, her composition finally cracking. "So, you'll become a killer again, like in the war? Like at Sand Creek?" Caleb's hands stilled, his expression shifting to a cold, terrible surprise. "How did you?" "Tomas told me," Sinitsa admitted, her voice trembling slightly, "about the scout who became a deputy, who resigned after he saw too much, after he participated in the terrible things. He told me the weight you carry." The silence stretched between them like a widening chasm, filled with 20 years of unspoken grief and guilt. Caleb's face hardened again, shuddering off whatever vulnerability had briefly appeared. That was a different life. A man's past is his own damn fault. Sinitsa began gathering her few possessions. The dress Silas had given her, her turquoise pendant, the small knife she kept for protection. Her movements were deliberate, mirroring his preparations. "Then I'll go back to Red Rock Landing. Silas will take me in until I can find passage elsewhere. The Kincaids will be watching the roads. Better than seeing you destroyed because of me." Her voice finally broke on the last word, the emotion she'd been containing spilling through the cracks of her careful control. They moved in opposite directions, the cabin suddenly too small for the weight of their unspoken fears. His that caring would lead to devastating loss again, and hers that she had brought only destruction to the one person who had shown her kindness. Caleb's hand was on the door, his heart already hardening for the brutal path ahead, when he heard the sound of breaking pottery. He spun around to see Sinitsa standing frozen, staring down at the pieces of a teacup that had been sitting on the sideboard, the last intact piece from the set that had belonged to Martha Stone, Caleb's late wife. The teacup lay in fragments on the dirt floor, white porcelain scattered like broken promises. Sinitsa knelt immediately, gathering the pieces with trembling hands, tears finally falling silently onto the fragments. "I'm sorry," she whispered, grief for the cup compounding her grief for his loss. "It was your wife's. I saw the flowers painted on it." Caleb stood motionless for a long, silent moment before setting down his saddlebags. He knelt beside her, his rough, scarred hands joining hers in collecting the delicate shards. "It's just a cup," he murmured, the words hollow. But they both knew it was more than that. It was the last tangible piece of the life he'd lost, of the woman he'd failed to save, of the connection to humanity he'd severed when he built his walls of silence. Sinitsa carried the broken pieces to the table, arranging them carefully. From a shelf, she retrieved a small pot of glue used for mending harnesses. With methodical, quiet precision, she began reassembling the cup, piece by fragile piece. "Things that break can be mended," she said, focusing intently on her work. "Not the same, but sometimes stronger at the broken places." Caleb watched her hands work their patient magic, the cup gradually taking shape again under her care. The silence between them shifted from tension to something quieter, a shared understanding forming without the need for words, the connection that comes when two people accept their shared brokenness. "I'm not leaving to kill them," Caleb finally said, his gaze fixed on her hands. "I'm going to get legal papers from the county seat, property deed, in both our names." Tsinitsa's hands stilled, her eyes lifting to meet his. "Both our names? Partnership agreement. Legal protection. If something happens to me, the ranch is yours, clear and documented. It gives you the standing you need, the means, the freedom from Kincaid's law." He spoke matter-of-factly, but the implications of such an arrangement hung in the air between them, a commitment, a sacrifice, a risk neither had been willing to voice before. "Why would you do that?" she asked, unable to hide her astonishment at this immense sacrifice of his solitary pride. Caleb studied the partially mended cup, choosing his words carefully, honoring her with the truth. "Been alone too long, Tsinitsa. Walls don't just keep people out, they keep you in." He met her gaze directly, the blue of his eyes finally showing a flicker of ancient flame. "Lost one life already. Don't aim to lose another by running." Tsinitsa's expression softened, understanding the cost of such an admission from this solitary, deeply honorable man. "I won't let you face them alone. Not anymore." Together, they finished mending the cup, their fingers occasionally brushing as they worked. The result was imperfect fine lines marking where the breaks had been, the handle slightly askew, but it held together, stronger at its broken places. As twilight gathered, they sat at the table drinking coffee from the mended cup, passing it between them in a ritual that felt strangely intimate. The partnership agreement lay between them, names joined in ink, as their lives had become joined through circumstance and choice, a sacred new bond. The sound of an approaching horse broke their quiet peace. Caleb rose and checked his rifle, peering through the window at the solitary rider coming slow along the trail. "It's Ethan Kincaid," he said, recognizing the youngest son. "Riding alone, without a torch." "A trap?" Tsinitsa asked, already moving toward the shotgun leaning against the wall. Caleb watched the rider's careful approach, hands conspicuously empty of weapons. "Maybe not. He's coming in the open." No sign of the others. The young one always had a conscience. They exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two broken people finding strength in their mending. Caleb met Ethan Kincaid at the edge of the yard, rifle held loose, but ready. "That's far enough, boy." The youngest Kincaid's son reined his horse to a stop, hands raised to shoulder height to display his peaceful intentions. At 26, Ethan lacked the hardened edge of his father and brothers. His face showed strain, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his usually clean-shaven jaw. "I came alone, unarmed," he called, keeping his distance respectfully. "I need to talk to you, Mr. Stone and Mrs. Kincaid." Caleb studied him, weighing possibility against risk. "Dismount slow. Leave your gun belt on the saddle." Ethan complied, movements deliberate to avoid misunderstanding. Once on the ground, he turned his pockets inside out, an old cavalry trick showing he carried no hidden weapons, a gesture not lost on Caleb. "State your business," Caleb said as Ethan approached. "Pa's planning to burn you out completely tomorrow night." Ethan's voice was low, urgent. "Got Sheriff Vance and Deputy Morris in his pocket. They're calling it a posse to arrest you for kidnapping, but that's not what they mean to do." "Oh." Tsinitsa appeared on the porch, shotgun in hand, her eyes narrowed in fierce judgment. "Why tell us this, Ethan Kincaid?" Ethan looked at the ground, shame evident in his posture. "What they did to you wasn't right, Tsinitsa. What they're doing now isn't right. My conscience is gone, but my stomach still turns." He glanced back toward town, nervousness clear in his movements. "Jasper's been drinking heavy since the courthouse, talking wild and poisonous. Pa won't look kindly on this visit." "I know. Can't go back now." The simple statement carried the weight of a life-changing decision. Caleb exchanged a look with Tsinitsa, a silent communication passing between them. She nodded slightly, lowering the shotgun. "Come inside," Caleb said. "Tell us exactly what they're planning. We need to fight this with honor." "Leo, if you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters." The cabin felt crowded with 3 people around the small table. Ethan sat with his back to the wall, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Tsinitsa had silently provided, a simple act of Navajo hospitality that seemed to genuinely surprise him. 8 men total, Ethan explained. Pa, Jasper, Simon, Deputy Morris, and his cousin from the next county. 3 hired guns from Fort Worth who owe Pa favors. He traced a rough map on the tabletop with his finger. They'll come from 3 directions after midnight. Plan to surround the place. Fire the few outbuildings left. Drive you out toward the canyon mouth, where they'll be waiting to kill Mr. Lair. Stone, and take Tsinitsa back by force. Oh, quote. Caleb listened impassively, but his mind was already calculating angles, positions, and vulnerabilities. The ranch was indefensible with just 3 people, even if Ethan could be trusted with a weapon. We need to ride to town tonight, Caleb said, turning to Tsinitsa. Wake the Reverend if necessary. Time to gather whatever allies we can find. Justice will not be done in the dark. Red Rock Landing's not safe for Tsinitsa, Ethan warned. Pa's got men watching Silas's place in the boarding house. They know she might run. Not going there, Caleb replied. The church, Reverend Michael Collins. He keeps to himself, but he doesn't bow to Thaddeus Kincaid or anyone else. He believes in the law of a higher power and the law of man's conscience. Tsinitsa nodded in agreement. Reverend Collins has no love for the Kincaids. William once interrupted his sermon, drunk and belligerent. The Reverend never forgot the disrespect to his church, to his God. Caleb began gathering what they would need. The property papers, the employment contract, what little money he had saved, and the sacred, mended teacup. Ethan, you come with us or stay here. No second chances after this. The young man's face showed conflict. Can't go back to Pa. Can't ride with you into town either. I'd be recognized as a traitor. End quote. North of here, near the high plateau, I know of an old line shack, Caleb offered. Not much, but it's shelter. A few horses left there. I'll wait there, Ethan decided. Maybe I can warn you if they move early. You'll need me to bear witness. The plan settled. They prepared to ride. As they mounted their horses, Caleb noticed Tsinitsa taking one last look at the small patch of turned earth she'd claimed tiny green shoots just breaking through the resistant soil. The sight hardened his resolve. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the right to build something new from broken ground, a fight for the future of Wild West love. The church stood at the western edge of Red Rock Landing, its white clappered walls ghostly in the moonlight. Reverend Collins answered the back door with a Bible in one hand and an old Colt revolver in the other, a man familiar with both salvation and practicality. Abel Carver, he said with mild surprise. And Mrs. Kincaid, I presume. Better come in quickly. I expected Thaddeus Kincaid would choose darkness for his vengeance. The Reverend's study was crowded as Silas, the store owner, and Tomas Reyes, the blacksmith divided by notary, joined them, having been quietly summoned. It's gone beyond trouble, Tsinitsa explained, her voice steady. They mean to burn us out and murder Caleb under the pretense of a legal posse. That murder disguised as justice is still murder, Collins said, his expression grim. What do you need, Caleb? Caleb placed the partnership agreement on the desk. Witness and notary, Reverend. Finalizing this legal document makes Tsinitsa a co-owner of my ranch. It's filed, it's legal, and it removes Kincaid's final legal claim to her as property. Collins examined the document with care, his eyes widening slightly at the complete, selfless transfer of title. Such a sacrifice between 2 people is highly unusual, Mr. Stone. It's necessary, Caleb replied, his honor demanding the risk. The Reverend nodded thoughtfully, reaching for his notary seal. The law may arrive too late to prevent violence, but perhaps not too late for justice afterward. I'll witness this, and I'll send copies to the county seat by tomorrow's mail coach. The small room grew crowded with the sheer force of their collective will. Silas carried a bundle of ammunition and medical supplies, while Tomas brought his own rifle. Why risk yourselves for us? Tsinitsa asked, overwhelmed by this sudden, fierce community. Thaddeus Kincaid's power has always fed on silence and the fear of the weak, Silas said simply. Take that away, and he's just a bitter old man with dwindling influence. It's easier to stand together, say. No. As they finalized their plans, Eliza Thornton, the elderly postmistress, appeared at the door with coffee and information. Deputy Morris was seen buying extra ammunition, she reported without preamble, and the Kincaid boys are drinking at Wilkins' saloon, talking loud about settling scores. They might move earlier than planned. Then we should return now, Tsinitsa said with quiet determination, pulling Caleb's shotgun close. I won't be driven from home again. Oh. As they prepared to leave, Caleb looked at the unlikely allies gathered in the Reverend's study, a shopkeeper, a blacksmith, a postmistress, a preacher, and the native woman who had changed everything by surviving. Lines had been drawn, but not the ones Thaddeus Kincaid expected. They rode out as dawn approached. 6 defenders against 8 attackers. Not favorable odds by normal reckoning, but Caleb had fought longer odds before, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. The riders approached from the east, silhouettes darkening against the rising sun as they crossed Caleb's property line. 8 men in full formation. Thaddeus Kincaid at the center, flanked by his sons Jasper and Simon. Deputy Morris rode slightly behind, his badge glinting to provide the veneer of legal authority. The 3 hired strangers completed the group. Caleb stood on his porch, rifle held casually at his side. Behind him, Tsinitsa waited in the doorway. Reverend Collins, Silas, Thomas, and Eliza positioned themselves visibly around the yard, a circle of unwavering, public witnesses to whatever would unfold. Ethan Kincaid, riding Caleb's second horse, joined them at dawn, choosing his side in the coming confrontation with a quiet, powerful courage. That's far enough, Kincaid, Caleb called when the riders reached the halfway point. His voice carried across the morning air, steady and uncompromising. Thaddeus Kincaid raised his hand, bringing his group to a halt. Surprise flickered across his face at the sight of the witnesses, quickly replaced by his practiced confidence. You're harboring my daughter-in-law against her will, Stone. Deputy Morris has papers for her return and your arrest. Mrs. Kincaid is here by choice, Caleb replied evenly. And she's not alone. This is now a matter of public witness, Thaddeus, not a midnight ambush. Oh. Thaddeus's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the gathered allies, his gaze lingering on his youngest son. Boy, what are you doing? You stand against your own blood? What's right, Pa? Ethan said, his voice stronger now. For once, what's right? The woman belongs with family, Thaddeus insisted, addressing the witnesses. This man's taken advantage of her confused, savage state. I'm not confused, Tsinitsa called, stepping forward to stand beside Caleb. And I'm exactly where I choose to be. I am ranch steward and co-owner of this claim. Reverend Collins moved to stand on Caleb's other side, his Bible held conspicuously in one hand. Mrs. Kincaid appears perfectly sound to me, as does her choice of companions. When you plan arson and murder, Mr. Kincaid, it ceases to be a family matter and becomes a community concern, a sin I cannot overlook. Caleb stepped forward, the signed partnership agreement in hand. Tsinitsa is legal co-owner of this property as of last night, notarized and filed. She's not your daughter-in-law anymore, Thaddeus. She's my business partner. The law says a widow with employment and property has no legal obligation to her husband's family. Not anymore. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Jasper's hand hovered near his pistol. Take one step closer, and I'll consider it trespassing with intent to harm. Caleb's rifle shifted slightly. Deputy Morris hesitated, his badge suddenly feeling heavier than it should under the combined gaze of the Reverend, the blacksmith, and the postmistress. The plan had shifted from a simple, profitable ambush to a public execution before 6 honest witnesses. Thaddeus recognized his diminishing control. This isn't over, Stone. There are other ways to settle accounts. No, there aren't, Caleb replied steadily, embodying a quiet, resolute honor. Not anymore. You come near this ranch, near Tsinitsa, near any of us again. I'll have witnesses sign complaints with the territorial marshal, good people who will testify to threats, arson, and attempted murder. How long do you think you'll keep your land then, Thaddeus? The law may be slow, but it catches up with the arrogant. The standoff stretched, tension vibrating in the morning air. Finally, Simon Holt reached over and placed his hand on his father's arm. "Pa," he said quietly, "we should go. The law is not with us today." With visible reluctance, Thaddeus Kincaid ordered his sons to retreat. As they turned their horses, Thaddeus fixed his youngest son with a final, withering stare. "Ethan, this is your last chance to remember where you belong." Ethan stood his ground, though his voice softened slightly. "I know exactly where I belong, Pa, right here, doing what's right." Thaddeus's face hardened into a final mask of cold rage. Without another word, he spurred his horse, leading his diminished party back across the property line. The threat hadn't ended, merely changed form, but the immediate danger had passed. Caleb lowered his rifle. Beside him, Tsanitsaa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining in a grip both fierce and tender, the promise of a future secured in a moment of shared sacrifice. "If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." The ranch did more than survive the winter. It flourished, bringing green to places long barren. Tsanitsaa's garden, coaxed from the resistant, rocky soil through stubborn Navajo care, yielded an abundance of beans and squash. The corral rose again, built by hands both familiar and new. Ethan stayed on as a ranch hand, finding peace in honest labor. Tomas lent his strength on weekends, and Silas provided credit. The story of the stand, the 6 against 8, became the stuff of Wild West stories, a legend whispered with respect in Red Rock Landing. One evening, a year later, Caleb and Tsanitsaa sat together on the porch, watching the vast, endless stars rise over the red rock. Between them, on the bench, sat the mended teacup, its fractures visible but strong. "The territorial judge in Flagstaff needs a clerk who can read the old tribal treaties," Caleb said, breaking a comfortable silence. Tsanitsaa smiled slightly, understanding the unspoken suggestion. "Are you trying to be rid of me, Caleb Stone? The cowboy love stories you read always end with the woman staying put, cooking the beans. Just thinking you might miss teaching, and that I might miss you arguing the law with me." His hand found hers in the cool darkness. "Wouldn't have to be one or the other. We sold the best of the herd to Tomas. The land is secure. The Kincaids are gone to Texas. We have freedom now." She considered this, her head tilted, the turquoise pendant catching the faint starlight. Perhaps a new path is not found in settling down, but in walking or riding forward. Her fingers tightened around his. "If my business partner agrees to become my Wild West love story companion on the road, I agree." He kissed her then, a brief, dry touch of commitment, of two isolated souls finally, irrevocably connected. They packed only what they needed, the deed to the ranch, signed over to Ethan and the community for a fair price, the old Winchester, Tsanitsaa's gardening tools, and the mended teacup, wrapped carefully in the fragments of the Navajo blanket. At dawn, 2 figures on horseback rode away from the ranch, not toward any town, but toward the distant, hazy boundary of the great Navajo Nation, a vast, unbound territory of red canyons and deep, abiding silence, the promise of freedom stretching out before them like a golden ribbon. They carried no fixed destination, only the certain knowledge that the real journey, the real healing, the real adventure was only just beginning, and they would face it together. Their path led away from the past, into the vast, open future, an endless Wild West love adventure. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.